Today's subject will be William Dean's experiments. It's going to be a longer one, perhaps the longest I've done yet. We'll cover a couple of engines I've already touched on before, like number 36 and 13, but most of these are more or less untouched by me, so let's get started. In the 1880s and 1890s, William Dean was allowed, or perhaps encouraged, to experiment with some new designs. Today we're discussing that list, and if I can find enough context, some of the engines they would have worked alongside. Number 1, built at Swindon in 1880, was a 440 tank engine, with double frames and a bogie with no central pivot point. Now I won't pretend to understand how that works, but I'd assume it means that while the bogie was separate from the drivers, it was still attached pretty rigidly to the frame, making it less flexible than it perhaps could have been. The engine had a boiler diameter of 4 foot 2 inches, at 140 psi, and 5 foot 6 inch driving wheels. It had 2 cylinders 17 inches in diameter, making them fairly large. In this form, it had a wheelbase of 21 feet. It had a rebuild just 2 years into its life, making it a 240T, cutting 4.5 feet off of its wheelbase. From 1882 to 1899, it continued in this form. In 1899, it was given a slightly larger boiler with a much higher pressure, now at 165 psi with a round-top firebox. By now, it was 19 years old, which was not bad at all for a single locomotive, and yet it had more to give. In 1914, it underwent yet another rebuild, giving it a bell-pair firebox. It survived yet another 10 years, finally being withdrawn in 1924. So, what was it doing, and what engines was it working with? The Great Western Railway had been building metro tanks from 1868 onward, a class of 240 tank engine with 5-foot drivers and 16-inch cylinders. I find it likely that after its rebuild, and due to the similarities in designs, number 1 would have fallen in line with the metro tanks. Given its slightly larger proportions, it was probably a bit stronger and just a bit faster, but of course, that wouldn't be a problem. At some point before 1910, it would have been kicked off of these duties in favor of prairies, and it probably would be kicked down to a branch line, where it held on until just after the grouping, when at 42 years of age and non-standard design, would have it condemned. Prairies, county tanks, panniers, and even the metro tanks were simply more practical, cheaper to overhaul regardless of performance. But a 42-year service life is nothing short of exceptional for an experimental locomotive. It must have been at least good enough after its 1882 rebuild, and the grouping was just a good excuse to get rid of it. Number 7 is the next on our list, built in 1886 and living a short, very turbulent life. It was built at Swindon as a 240 tandem compound engine. Its low-pressure cylinders were 23 inches in diameter, and the high-pressure were 15 inches. Tandem compound technology had been around since the 1860s in the US, and Dean thought he should give it a go with numbers 7 and 8. With number 7, the low-pressure cylinders were placed in front of the high pressures, and each set of cylinders drove a separate axle. Number 7 was standard gauge. Number 8 was very similar in design and built the same year as number 7, but for broad gauge, with the cylinders being 21 inches and 14 inches in diameter, for low and high pressure respectively. While I couldn't find any info about number 7, number 8 had a 180 psi boiler, and was double framed. Again, this was unsuccessful, and rather than being converted in gauge or entering service, it was simply set aside. In 1887, number 7 was set aside as well, and in 1890 it was taken to pieces, having parts used to construct a new member of the Armstrong 440s, and number 8 would join it just 2 years later. These were considered renewals, which effectively meant the workshop wanted to keep the accountants happy and wrote them down as rebuilds instead of new engines with a couple of old bits thrown in there. So, what was used in the new engines? Well, the wheel centers, of course. These engines wouldn't ever enter service to work alongside other classes. They were cut up and called renewals. Quick tangent about the Armstrong 440s. The class were pioneering 440s for the Great Western, named after a previous chief mechanical engineer. They were nearly rebuilt into Dean's single 222 engines before the Box Hill Tunnel derailment, which I talked about briefly in another video. As such, they stayed as 440s, eventually being rebuilt into Flower class 440s, and they'd live on in this form for a few more years. The Flower class would be the basis for the cities, but none of the Armstrong 440s would get that far. Instead, in 1928, the first was withdrawn, and the last to go in just 1930. 2 more engines used to make the Armstrong class will be discussed shortly. For now, on to the next. Number 9 was built in 1881 as a very strange 424 Express tank engine. It had huge 7-foot 8-inch drivers, and was the only 424T built for the Great Western, though they did inherit a few from the Bristol and Exeter Railway. It ran on Stephenson link valve gear with inside frames. It had a 30-foot wheelbase, and sadly, it was exceptionally unstable. It did little work, because if it did, it would spend most of its time in some state of derailment. It actually derailed right in front of William Dean himself on its first attempt to move out of the shed. There was supposed to be a second one with Joy valve gear, but upon witnessing the derailment, Dean cancelled the order. The other valve gear and cylinders for this engine were actually repurposed for number 1833, the last experiment we'll discuss on this list. In 1884, it would be rebuilt as a 222, with a substantial amount of the locomotive being cut off. The wheelbase was cut from 30 feet to just 18. It had a new boiler with a round-top firebox and different carrying wheels. Again, in 1890 it was rebuilt. It now had smaller 7-foot drivers and frames extended by 3 inches. The result was something similar to the Great Western Queen class, a traditional 222 express engine. It was named Victoria in honor of Queen Victoria, and in 1902 it was rebuilt with a Belpaire firebox, which in hindsight was a bit of a waste given it was withdrawn in just 1905. Number 10 was a nondescript 222 built in 1886, similar to the first rebuild of number 9, and was rebuilt again the same way number 9 was. In this form it held the name Royal Albert. The Queen class totaled 21 engines, and handled the top express services from the early 1870s up to 1900 when bigger, better engines came in. They had 7-foot drivers and 18-inch cylinders. They were quite powerful for 222s, and were likely very fast, but with poor adhesion and acceleration due to their wheel arrangement. They held on to those top link express duties for longer than some Great Western classes survived in total. But outside of being fast, there was nothing to them, so when the express trains went out from under them, the class was doomed to scrap. Number 13 was touched on briefly in my video about the bird cages. It appeared in 1886 as a 242 well tank, with 2 low-mounted water tanks, one between the frames and one under the coal bunker. It worked on the St. Ives branch, which was actually dual gauge at the time, running both broad gauge and standard. In 1897, it was rebuilt as a 440 saddle tank. The bunker and rear tank were cut down to allow for a trailing truck to be removed. It worked on several branches, even being loaned out for a bit before returning to Swindon Works, shunting there until it was set aside for withdrawal in 1926. It inspired the bird cages, and it would have worked alongside all of the classes that were pushed onto branches. Metro tanks, panniers, small prairies, 517s, anything like that, and very briefly, some broad gauge engines. For an experiment, it still managed a full 40-year service life. Impressive. Bit ugly, but impressive. In 1888, numbers 14 and 16 were built as a pair of fairly conventional engines. There were 2 4.0s, described as similar to the Barnum class, which were built just the next year, meaning they would have had sandwich frames, a Duke boiler, and they would have been quite strong and fast for their time. There were a couple of big differences though. The Barnum class were standard gauge and had driving wheels 6 foot 1.5 inches in diameter. 14 and 16 were broad gauge and built with 7 foot and 1/2 inch driving wheels. When broad gauge was done away with, the pair were rebuilt into Armstrong 440s, making the other half of the class we'd discussed previously. On to the next! Numbers 34 and 35 were built in 1890. They were a pair of small 042 tank engines, with driving wheels just 4 feet in diameter, making the common 3521 class look huge. Interestingly, they took the numbers from a pair of long boiler 060s built by George Armstrong. Also interestingly, they were rebuilt as 044 tanks in 1895, just 5 years after their construction. In this form, its stumpy side tanks would have been accompanied by a small tank in the back of the engine under the bunker. In 1906, number 35 was withdrawn for scrapping, and in 1908, number 34 was withdrawn, but not yet scrapped. Number 34 would spend some time at the Longmoor Military Railway, and was only properly withdrawn in 1921, with a life of 31 years, nearly doubling its sister's lifespan. I'm sure by now you've noticed we're going by number and not chronology, which means you know what's next. Number 36. I've done a video on number 36 in the past, and it was incredibly rushed and incredibly lazy. The background footage was a London Northwestern design, not Great Western, and I didn't even give it a thumbnail. Today, I'd like to course correct. Please join me for a quick look into the Great Western Railway number 36, the Crocodile. This was the Great Western's first 460 design, though not the first of the arrangement in the UK. In 1894, the Highland Railway Big Goods class was built in Scotland. In 1896, number 36 was outshopped with a very different design, but very similar philosophy. Big 460 large firebox overtop small driving wheels, made to pull heavy trains over arduous terrain. Unlike the Big Goods though, number 36 was a solitary engine, and an experiment rather than a complete class. As odd as it may look, the design was entirely of Dean's own. An engine was needed to haul heavy trains, which the contemporary 060s were struggling with. Why not double head? Well, there's a lot of costs to go into that. Double the crew wages, double fuel costs, double maintenance costs, extra hazards if they've got to go in tunnels, because one engine will choke out the crew of the next. One big engine needs less upkeep than two normal-sized ones anyway, and it can be run by the same two men. This design was experimental, sure, but it leaned heavily on what Dean had produced before. This is the Duke Class 440, designed by William Dean, likely with help from his assistant. You'll find if you look at this picture of a Duke with a round-top firebox, and then this picture of the Crocodile, there is some resemblance. It's likely that a lot of the design, including the boiler, was taken right from a Duke for number 36. Of course, different frames would have to be built to accommodate the wheel arrangement and a wider firebox. The wheels on number 36 were just 4 foot 7.5 inches in diameter. It had a boiler pressure of 165 psi, powering 2 cylinders 20 inches in diameter. The long parallel boiler was positioned high above the frames, allowing its firebox to sit lower while still being above the driving wheels. The engine weighed 59 tons and would have had no trouble keeping grip on less than ideal track. She would have been dark green with bright red frames, as a Great Western engine tended to be at the time. And she was restricted to a certain area of operation, exactly where she was built for. There is no denying that it looks funny, of course, and it would have been quite slow, but the engine was built to take long trains through the Severn Tunnel, removing the need to double head, and it did just that with ease. However, William Dean's health was declining, and it wasn't long before Churchward took over. He had no interest in number 36, and made his own heavy goods engine, the 2800 class. The 2800 class had a boiler pressure of 225 psi, a 280 wheel arrangement, and a tractive effort that made number 36 look absolutely gutless. The 2800s began to appear in 1905, and immediately number 36 was withdrawn and scrapped. While impressive for her time, the Crocodile was still a bit late. She inspired the Aberdares, the first Great Western moguls, but those are a subject for another day. She also opened the door to the 460 wheel arrangement on the Great Western, even if she is a bit frumpy compared to the more elegant lineage she started. You can expect number 36 to have spent an awful lot of time working with the Dean goods, which were the contemporary 060s that she was designed to supplement. On to the next. Number 1490 was built in 1898, as the only 440 pannier tank ever built for the Great Western, or the UK as a whole for that matter. The engine, as most Great Western machines were, was completed at Swindon. This was actually the Great Western's first pannier tank. It was meant to be the prototype for a class to work on the Metropolitan Railway. This engine proved unstable, however, and heavy, making it unsuitable for fast starts on lightly constructed infrastructure. It had 4 foot 7.5 inch driving wheels, and its bogie was similar to something taken off of a carriage. It was sold to a steel company just 9 years into its life after a short career as a shunter. Just a year later, it was sold to the Brecon and Merthyr Tydfil Junction Railway, who kept it again for only 8 years. At this point, in 1916, it was sold off to the Cramington Colliery, where it worked until withdrawal in 1929, a respectable 31 years old. Not a glamorous career, and it never stayed in one place for too long, but it lived a full life, in spite of poor performance initially. Number 1833 will be the last engine we discuss today. However, it was one of the first experiments chronologically, with previously mentioned 1490 being the last built. As I mentioned earlier, number 9, the 424 tank, had Stephenson valve gear and was meant to have a Joy valve gear counterpart. Its instability got the plan cancelled, and the valve gear was kept for another engine. This is that engine. Number 1833 was a side tank engine of an 060 wheel arrangement, completed in 1882. It only operated in this arrangement for less than 2 years. For some reason, the amount of water in its tanks affected the valve gear. It was rebuilt into a tender engine in 1884, To my knowledge, the only difference was the removal of tank's bunker and back wall of the cab, sticking a conventional tender to the back of it. It worked in this form for 12 years, being withdrawn in 1906 with a total working life of 24 years. I can't tell if it performed poorly, or if it was withdrawn for just being too non-standard, or perhaps the third option, it was immediately made outdated by bigger, stronger passenger and goods engines being built. As I'm poking around online, I can't seem to find any pictures, or even much information at all on this engine. Perhaps it's worth another look at a time when I've got more resources. As you will have noticed, not a single one of these engines survived. Indeed, the oldest Great Western engine to make it into preservation was a Dean Goods built in 1897, making it younger than all but one of these experiments. The next oldest Great Western engine in preservation is City of Truro from 1903, and after that, the oldest Great Western engine in private preservation is number 2807, built in 1905. It seems that Churchward had no interest in keeping around old designs, and as unfortunate as that is, it's also part of why he was so good at his job. He took the Great Western Railway from Dean singles to cities to saints in no time at all, always looking to make the next best locomotive. Number 36 was the biggest goods engine under William Dean's charge. Churchward made the 2800s less than a decade later, which could do what number 36 could, without breaking a sweat. They could take trains 2 to 3 times what a Dean Goods might have, saving on crew costs and maintenance. And he didn't get hung up on failure either. When he made the Great Bear and it kinda sucked, he pushed forward with 460s, which he had been doing well already. And Churchward's successor made sure the Great Western went from strength to strength in locomotive design, following the lines Churchward had laid. The Great Western was the only railway that could make a 460 consistently compete with Pacifics, and exceed them in some areas. Their heavy goods engines couldn't be questioned, and even their less remarkable classes tended to perform well enough for a long time. Their desire to be the best did make them memorable, but it also meant they threw away important bits of history at every turn. No Metro tanks have survived, no Dean singles, none of the experiments. One purely Dean engine survived, and the only other example of Dean influence is Duke Dog number 9017, which is a combination of 2 Dean engines by Charles Collett to solve a power crisis on the old Cambrian railway lines. Even that engine is on static display at the moment. There's always going to be this big void in railway preservation, especially for the Great Western Railway, which is somewhat shocking, as they have several classes preserved in quantity. Hey guys, no long drawn-out outro today. Thanks for watching, and if you've got any suggestions or requests for what you'd like to see next, let me know down in the comments.